All right, students. Today we're going to be continuing to read about explorers of the early European exploration age. And we talked about Vespucci yesterday. Now, Vespucci was so famous because he's the one that proved Columbus wrong. Columbus, of course, thought he got to Asia, and he was totally wrong. And so Vespucci is the man who found out that he had come to a brand new continent. And here's what they thought that our continent looked like. This is what they thought North and South America looked like at that point because they didn't know how large it was. But Vespucci did prove that they had found a new continent of America and not, in fact, Asia, which is where Columbus thought he had gone all the way around the world to reach. So that's why we're called America, because it's Amerigo Vespucci. And we're not called Vespucci Land because that's his last name. Now, today we're going to read about actually one of my favorite explorers, and that is Vasco Nunez de Balboa. Now, Balboa is a lot of fun because Balboa, he kind of jumped all over the place, and he was like the ultimate adventurer for the time, okay? This is an exciting time to be Spanish, not an exciting time to be a Native American, because the Spanish were going and taking everything over, stealing everyone's gold, and taking their land, and the Native Americans were getting killed off. It was not a great time to be a Native American. But if you're Balboa, it's a lot of fun, I guess. Now, let's start reading about Balboa right here. It says, on September 27th, 1513, a group of explorers climbed up a mountain. It was on the west coast of what is today called the Isthmus of Panama. Isthmus? That's a tough word. Everyone try and say isthmus. Try and whisper it to yourself, though. An isthmus is a narrow strip of land that connects two larger land areas. The Isthmus of Panama connects the two continents we know today as North America and South America. This little pink spot, Panama right here, that's an isthmus. See how it's a narrow strip of land between the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean? Now, this area right here, this is where Balboa eventually ends up. Now, he had tons of adventures before he reaches Panama, but he crosses that narrow strip of land called an isthmus, and he's the one that first walks into the Pacific Ocean. Oh, I'm sorry, not the first person, because that's ridiculous. All the Native Americans were there first. He's the first European, which really, who cares? But he did, and he actually ended up going to the Pacific Ocean, and he claimed the entire ocean for Spain. Now, I'm going to flip back to our page. That's what an isthmus is. It looks just like the country of Panama. And it says right here, the group of explorers made up of Spanish and African soldiers and Native American guides had landed on the east coast and walked west until they reached the mountain. Moving ahead of the rest, Vasco Nunez de Balboa quickly climbed the last few feet to the mountain peak. Before him lay a huge blue sea. Falling to his knees, Balboa said that the sea, what would later be called the Pacific Ocean, belonged to Spain. A few days later, Balboa and the others reached the ocean and explored the coast. Christopher Columbus had believed that Asia stretched from near the eastern edge of Europe all the way around the world. First of all, he was wrong. But let's see what else it says. He thought that if he sailed west from Europe and crossed a very narrow Atlantic Ocean, he would reach it. Now Balboa had come upon a huge ocean on the western side of what Columbus had said was Asia. This proved that Vespucci was right. This also proved that Columbus was wrong. Columbus had not reached Asia, but had reached a new continent instead. So, what body of water did Balboa reach? Yep, the Pacific Ocean. That's correct. Now, let's go back real quick. I just want to look at something that we kind of skipped over on the previous page. If you look back at the page before us here, and take a look at this ship. It doesn't look very big here, but that was kind of the point. This is called a caravel. Now, a caravel was a new type of ship that people were building, and the exciting thing about this ship for all the Europeans was it was fast, and it also could carry a lot of goods underneath the hold. This is the hold of the ship down here. You look at number 7, that's where they kept the food supplies. Now, I want you to track each of these numbers, and kind of explore some parts of this ship, and I'm going to pause the video and start it back up in just a moment, and we'll talk a little bit more about this very special piece of technology, the caravel. So, you should have read over each of these numbers at the bottom of the screen and taken a look at each of the parts of the caravel ship. The main thing to remember about the caravel is it had new types of sails, a triangular sail that would allow it to sail over the roughest seas. Now, you can kind of see that right over here. It allowed them to sail directly into the wind by tacking. Tacking is when you go zigzag into the wind with the sailboat. Now, they had some of these rectangular sails. Those are the main sails, but they also had this little triangular one in the front and the back. And those new triangular sails allowed their ships to move faster and to maneuver more on rough seas. And so they could explore farther and they could do more. Now, if you think back to Columbus's ships were caravels, and that was the technology that made it possible for all these explorers to do what they did. Now, we talked about Balboa. I want you to think to yourself, what did Balboa accomplish? Now, he was a great explorer, but what did he accomplish? He claimed the entire Pacific Ocean. He said, this entire sea is that and everything it touches, this is all for Spain. Now, Spain was grabbing all kinds of stuff at this point, and did they really own the entire Pacific Ocean? No. And did they know how big it was? Oh, no. But they said, oh, it's ours, even though they couldn't control it. Now, the next person that explored even further, so he was like, okay, there's supposed to be this huge ocean on the other side of America, because now at this point they were starting to call it America after Amerigo Vespucci, because they realized it was not Asia. The next person is Magellan. Now, Magellan was going to cross and around, and he eventually tries to go all the way around the earth in his ship. Now, we're going to read about him. He has a rough end. Oh, by the way, someone else had a rough end as well. Balboa, he ends up getting decapitated. If you don't know what that means, maybe you should study him and you can research it. It's not good. Now, Magellan sails around the world. Oh, sorry. No, Magellan doesn't sail around the world. Magellan's going to die halfway through, and you're going to see what happens to him. Magellan's crew sails around the world. So the people with him made it. He didn't make it. Let's read right here. On a September day in 1519, loud cannons boomed as 5 ships and about 250 sailors set sail from Spain into the Atlantic Ocean. Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese explorer, led the fleet. Magellan had convinced the King of Spain to pay for his expedition. Like I said, the Spanish, they're all about the money. And the Spanish, they were willing to spend a lot of money for exploration because they were taking a lot of land. An expedition is a journey taken for a special reason. The reason for Magellan's expedition was to find a way to reach Asia by sailing west around the Americas. Magellan sailed to what is now Brazil and then south along South America's eastern coast. For months, he sailed up rivers into the middle of the continent, hoping to find a river that would go all the way to the ocean on the other side. But he never did, and each time he had to sail the rivers back to the coast. As the ships fought their way through huge pounding waves and against howling winds, one ship lost and many of its crew were lost. So, at first, he tries to poke his way, like we talked about yesterday, he tried to poke his way through America. What he didn't realize is there's one thin spot in America, and that's where Balboa had gone, and that was the Isthmus of Panama. Now, they didn't realize that the rest of the continent was really thick. He just got lucky when he went to Panama and he could get through to the Pacific Ocean. So Magellan was like, oh, well, I'm sure the whole thing is just really thin, and we'll find a route right through. And so he tried to go up these rivers, and he couldn't do it. And so he poked and poked and poked, and eventually he found himself all the way to this place called the Strait of Magellan. Back then, it wasn't called that. It was named after him. And he made his way all the way around the tip of South America. And this was some really rough oceans down here near the South Sea, the South Antarctic Sea. And then he made it to the Pacific Ocean. Now, it says right here, finally, in the fall of 1520, 3 of Magellan's ships sailed through what is now called the Strait of Magellan, near the southern tip of South America. The sailors found themselves in the same ocean that Balboa had seen. But Magellan named it Pacific, which means peaceful, because it seemed so still and quiet compared to the Atlantic Ocean. Now, things didn't get peaceful and happy after he got to the Pacific. You're going to finish reading about our friend Magellan, and he does not make it. So good luck, finish the rest of our lesson, and see what happens to our friend Magellan.